community to share space, time, and ideas. I also want to thank Lily for fitting me into this schedule last minute. You see, I didn't have anything to share until the end of last semester. Granted, it is true that the core concepts of this talk presented themselves at the beginning of the semester in Robert's class. It wasn't until the end of the semester in Sean's class that I received the tools to articulate my thoughts. And to a large extent, that's what this talk is about. The analogical language that we use to express our understandings of the cosmos and the transcendent, the eminent beyond. And in many ways that I won't touch on today, this talk is a response to Thomas Ferry's call for a new story and a new mythology for our current times. So let's dive in. Over a century ago, the philosopher and psychologist William James pointed to our inability to articulate an experience of the transcendent. When we experience the divine, we find ourselves in a place beyond linguistic comprehension. As our own Sean Kelly has so eloquently shown in a pair of articles in the Journal of Transpersonal Psychology, when we do attempt to articulate any experience of the divine, the language and the words that we use evoke sensory and conceptual realities that are not properties of the divine, but of the unfolding of the innate linguistic properties of the language. In this case, Sean talked about the innate invocation of space, time, and hierarchy. In my talk, I would like to use this same concept to explore the evolutionary language that we have inherited from the spiritual and esoteric lineage that came out of the late 19th and early 20th century. More specifically, I will be looking at the evolutionary cosmologies of Sri Aurobindo, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, and slightly before them, Rudolf Steiner. Looking at their use of an evolutionary language and their insistence to speak of spirit and divine as one entity, I will show that the unfolding of the analogical dimensions of this language evoke a sense of competition and domination. I will then propose two linguistic shifts and explore the ways that their analogical and mythological invocations bring on a sense of cooperation, co-creation, and participation. While Aurobindo, Teilhard, and Steiner relied deeply on their spiritual and intuitive experiences to understand the cosmos and the divine, all three were educated in a European context, and their cosmologies can be seen to carry a strong dose of Hegel. This is present in their understanding of history as the evolutionary story of consciousness, where humanity becomes aware of its own past, present, and in doing so, participates in the creation of its future. And again, like Hegel, they understand spirit or the divine to be the primary source of all creation. Spirit was present before the birth of time and space. It is the source from which all of creation comes and the goal towards which it moves. This concept is best described through Aurobindo's notion of involution, which is the process through which spirit creates matter before evolution begins. Coming a century after Hegel, these thinkers had the privilege of the advancements within natural sciences and specifically the biological understanding of evolution. Integrating this scientific understanding into their own spiritual work, each brought forth a distinct spiritual cosmology. At their core, they all share the same trajectory of evolution from unconscious matter to a full spiritual awakening and a reunion with God within the next stage of human evolution. A process that begins with the creation of matter by spirit and continues through its evolution into more complex form, leading first to the birth of life, and then through further evolution in the birth of consciousness within human being. In this way, the evolution of consciousness is the process through which spirit comes into its fullest self-expression and self-realization through matter. This analogical language, which is used to describe this evolutionary flow that begins and ends with spirit, can be seen as the source of a new mythology that was born at the intersection of esoteric spirituality and scientific development. On the one hand, involution expands on the scientific understanding of evolution by providing it with a source of creation, a goal to move towards. On the other hand, from the spiritual and religious perspective, involution allows matter to possess a divinity that was otherwise lacking, an overall process that helps bridge the gap between spirit and matter. Looking at the analogical language that is used to describe these cosmologies, we are faced with two underlying concepts: evolution and relationship. The relationship between the different components of creation that is undergoing this evolutionary process, specifically spirit, matter, and the divine. So let's look at these concepts and then the analogical mythologies that they evoke within our psyches. Let's start with the esoteric components. When describing the evolution of consciousness, spirit is often or solely spoken of in terms of divine, while nature and matter receive their divinity from spirit. Even though this new mythology brings spirit and matter closer than they were before, it nonetheless holds spirit above matter. Matter is then something to be saved, something to be freed from and divinized. Matter has a subservient role to spirit and functions as something to transform or escape from throughout the course of history. Even Teilhard, whose relationship with matter is one of love and respect, sees the divinity present within it as one that stemmed from spirit and is not innate to matter itself. Within its mythological unfolding, we can see that spirit is spoken of as he, and matter and nature as she. Additionally, spirit and divine are used interchangeably, referring to both as he. This use of masculine spirit to refer to the divine oneness from which all come, within which all grow, and towards which all move, then leaves the feminine and matter in a place of inferiority to the masculine spirit. While these thinkers do strive to affirm the divinity of the feminine matter and its participatory role within the evolution of spirit, her role is nonetheless as a consort to the masculine and his evolution. Even Teilhard, whose love of the feminine is unmatched, describes the spiritual transformative power of the feminine in terms of its application to the transformation of man and masculine spirit. We can see here echoes of Eve's emersion from Adam, her inferiority to him, and her role in his psycho-spiritual development. Moving on to the scientific analogies that are used within this new cosmological language, we see that while modern science is born within a Christian context, it is in large a reaction to and a negation of this spiritual view. So, the modern scientific paradigm denies the existence of any spiritual or conscious existence that is beyond the human being and sees matter as the primary unit of creation. In this paradigm, consciousness is a byproduct of the evolutionary journey of life, which is a chance product of molecular interactions, a random molecular process that leads to a random evolutionary process, with no goal or direction. In scientific terms, the evolutionary process is one of competition, of domination, power struggles, and a progressive hierarchical movement of growth. Evolution is a dog-eat-dog world. As long as you and yours make it, the rest don't matter. You got to do what you got to do. Kill or be killed. This is what we evoke when we speak in evolutionary terms. Within its analogical core, our description of the cosmos as evolutionary evokes competition and dominance of the other, the feminine, nature, earth. As descendants of these cosmology, we here at PCC continue to use this evolutionary language. And when the concept of spirit is evoked, it is indeed used interchangeably with the concept of divine. To be sure, our enchanted view of the evolutionary process is far from the scientific paradigm. We speak of cooperation rather than competition, and of participation rather than domination. So it is here that I would like to introduce my first proposed change to the underlying analogical language that we use. While evolution is used to describe an external power struggle between different species and different members within a species, I would like to introduce a different term from biology: development. Now, when I talk about development, I don't mean something like child development or a psychospiritual development. Rather, I'm referring to embryology, the gestational development of a fetus within the womb, a process that has a telos, or a purpose and goal. While embryology does contain competition on the cellular level, this competition is held within an overall co-creative and participatory context within the oneness of the organism. Through this change of language, we move away from evoking linearity and a hierarchical growth that is based on competition and domination, and we move towards the evocation of a sense of growth that is rhythmic, cooperative, co-creative, and participatory. This new analogy allows for the integration of the modern embryological understanding of human being with our mythical understanding of ourselves and our cosmos. After all, if as above, then so below, then not only do we mirror the cosmos within our psychospiritual being, but also our bodily and physiological development. In this way, biology, and specifically embryology, brings a new dimension to the understanding of the cosmos as organic and its journey as developmental. Moving on to the esoteric analogies that we use, we can see that while the relationship between spirit and matter as one that is based on domination and superiority does indeed analogically correlate with an evolutionary language that evokes competition and domination, a developmental analogy calls for cooperation and co-creation. So I would like to introduce a second change in our cosmic analogies, which is the separation and distinction between masculine spirit and genderless divine oneness. Not only does matter need to be brought up in stature, but spirit needs to be brought down its pedestal. What I'm advocating for is not only the recognition of the divinity of matter, but also the recognition that spirit is itself a component of the divine and not one with it. It is time for spirit to wake up to the divinity in matter and its oneness within matter in this divinity. This demotion of spirit then allows for a shift in the relationship between matter and spirit, with the feminine taking its place alongside the masculine. The divine then becomes the paradoxical oneness of spirit and matter. This analogical alternative better fits the cooperative language of development and helps move towards an embodied cosmology that empowers not only the material and physiological dimensions of our experiences, but also the feminine as it manifests within mythology and unfolds in these analogies. Rather than Eve sitting at Adam's feet, we have Lilith sitting by his side. So, as we have seen, these changes in our linguistic analogies allow for the unfolding of a different story, one that shifts from the evolution of matter within spirit to the development of matter and spirit within a non-dual divine. In this alternative story, involution is the process through which the divine oneness pours itself into the polarity of spirit and matter, of conscious and unconscious, of masculine and feminine. This polarity then enters a co-creative developmental dialectical process through which the divine comes to recognize itself through the further entanglement of matter and spirit within creation, and vice versa. While an evolutionary language evokes a sense of linearity and hierarchical growth and advancement that is based on competition and domination, an embryological language around development allows for a shift towards a language that evokes a sense of growth that is rhythmic and cyclical, a process that contains co-creation, participation, and interdependence. Mythologically, it allows a feminine return to the body, a return to the concept of the earth as mother and the cosmos as divine womb. Similarly, a move away from the interchangeable use of spirit and divine allows for a language that equates matter and spirit in terms of divinity and power, a language that allows for a reunion of masculine and feminine within their divinity. My ambition is that this shift in language can allow for us not only to see the developing being as these esoteric and intuitive thinkers did, and not only would it allow us to hear the story that is being told as Thomas Berry did, but perhaps it can allow us to embody the feeling of this cosmic divinity as it unfolds through and within our psycho-spiritual and physiological developments. Thank you.
Hi, that was wonderful. And I'm so glad we started a little early. We have plenty of time for questions. So anybody who feels like they want to ask a question, go ahead and unmute yourself and chime in. Well, I can start. I really love what you've done here with this, the two words, the evolution and development. I've had a lot of trouble with the word evolution and the kind of many meanings that have been assigned to that word and that it carries. It can be sort of confusing at times, but I also really agree that it has a sort of a singular track, that I think that this suggestion of the word development instead, and the embryology, the image that you brought in with that is really remarkable, and really it feels very embodied. It feels very relational, but not lost in relation. And I'm wondering how you kind of came to this. And I know you kind of talk about it in the beginning of your talk of like these different thinkers and these things of bringing you to this, but was there anything in particular that inspired you to find this word and bring it in this way?
Sure, thank you. Thank you for your kind words. As many people may already know, I have a background in biology and in medicine. So when I came in, I already had a lot of embryology in my head. And from the very beginning, from the first semester, I was finding, all these different, just pattern recognition and seeing the universe is doing what a fetus is doing. And then Groff's work, of course, threw that all open, and it's like, oh my God, it really is doing that. So then it's like, well, if their psyche is doing that, then why isn't the body doing that? So if you're looking at the fetus, we should be looking at the fetus. So it's all really, that's underneath all of it. And I think just the blatantness of it in the class of just like, oh wow, they really do just say he for everything. And it's evolution, and they're missing out on these parts where just when you think about it, and especially after reading Sean's article, and thinking about the ways the language then forms the world that we're living in, it kind of allowed me to really work with these ideas. So a lot of this is pretty much everything that didn't make it in those two essays for those two classes. And I really kind of wanted to put in there, but it felt a little too much my own stuff, and I wanted to stick with that. So I was like, all right, this is a talk. This feels like a talk. So it's a lot of it was processed. I think it's processing from before, but also these two classes giving me the language to really be able to talk about it. Like, oh, okay, there is spirit, but then there's divine, and there's no separation. And there's matter, there's nature, and there's no separation. So I just kind of been playing with all of these ideas within the context of all the embryology, I guess, that's in my head.
Thank you. Awesome. There's a few things in the chat box if you want to take a look.
I had a question too, if that's all right. Yeah, so I really appreciate you bringing parity to spirit and matter. You know, I think the Hegelian tradition has such a strong emphasis on spirit, and then Marx perhaps came along and pushed matter. And I remember Robert once mentioning that Dewey, the educational pioneer, was somebody who really tried to balance institutions as well as consciousness. So I think it's great. You're not only elevating matter, but you're also bringing spirit off of its pedestal and maybe allowing it to just become part of the community of cosmological forces rather than being such on top of things. One question I have for you is, I sense a desire to soften what you describe as the evolutionary process. So using an astrological analogy, you know, you're familiar with trines, and for anybody who's not, a trine is when two forces are in a mutually supportive way being integrated. But you also have squares and oppositions, which are challenging, jagged, and at times have this domination aspect. So as you strive to bring what feels like a softer, perhaps a slightly more feminine perspective to our view of the cosmos, do you feel that it's important to retain some of those elements of competition, of domination, as just observing the reality of the cosmos? Or do you genuinely feel that, you know, this purely supportive, mutually enhancing approach is the most truthful way to see the cosmos?
Thank you, Veer. I think there is, even in an embryological model, there is definitely room for competition. If you're looking on the cellular level, when let's look at like neurons and the brain cells, and as they are developing, when they're very basic and they're not really neurons yet, there are these growth factors that are released that are limited. So it's limited resources. Whoever gets it, they live, and if you don't get it, you die. So there's still competition. If you make it, you make it, and if you don't, you die. So they're still fighting, and then they still have to one up each other and try to make it, and that still allows for the best one to make it. But at the end, when you're looking from further out, it's not just this we're just going and we're just eating, and there'll be more, don't worry about it. And it has a purpose. There is this bigger thing that is being created. So when you're looking from above, it's development. At the end of, if everything goes right, there will be a fetus, there will be a brains with brain cells, there will be a heart. Now, which cells made it? And perhaps there is a whole lineage of cells that died and they just didn't reproduce, so they didn't get to be a brain. So in that level, there is competition, but it's competition that has a purpose beyond individual needs, and it's more collective, and it's entangled with so much more than just itself.
It sounds like to me that you're kind of talking about more of like the idea of how things develop the best is more like a cooperation rather than a competition.
Yeah, and even if it is, there might still be competition in a sense, but it's not the same level of competition. Or perhaps the purpose is, but perhaps there's a reason, a purpose. That's perhaps the purpose is what's changing rather than the competition itself. The goal is changing.
Just to add in something that I'm hearing in both the conversations and the question is that it feels like context is what's most important for competition, because I love Abir's question and the fact that to simply get rid of angles, like, and to use the metaphor again, the oppositions and to get rid of the challenging, growth inspiring perhaps aspects or dynamics that go underway. You pointed to them as well. I don't know if that's the goal, otherwise they may not have been there in the first place, but to find the greater context in which they each have their equal and more appropriate expression, building back to your desire to, bring spirit down a bit and elevate, to really balance the conversation. But I'm seeing that it plays out in context, and that context is what is most important, because even as you describe the biological context there, and I don't have an example, but my curiosity goes to, well, I wonder if there is another context that might even challenge your assumption that's still cooperative. Do you know what I mean? That as contexts keep changing and perspectives get bigger, and from my perspective, it's all this. And from my perspective, from my context, it's all this. So it's just lit up a whole lot of great questions, but context, I feel like, is what you're pointing to there, and brilliant. So thank you again for putting your thoughts to paper. This has been very inspiring. Thank you.
I'd love to chime in. Thank you, Aya, for that presentation. I think you've offered a helpful sort of intervention just to bring more balance to how we understand spirit and matter. And I really feel in alignment with where you're trying to lead us. And in this conversation that we've been having about cooperation and competition, I wanted to offer a suggestion that in both cases, those who view evolution as a competition among individuals and those who see it as cooperation among individuals, there's this presupposition that they both share that separate individuals are either competing or cooperating. And I think what, in the context of the biological world, what we really see is that the notion of a separate individual is what needs to be questioned. And there are what would be called internal relationships among all individuals, whether we're talking about cells in the context of the development of an organism, or we're talking about organisms in the context of an evolving ecology. No individual organism is ever the same individual in two given moments. It's constantly being transformed by its environment and in turn transforming the environment. And so I think a more concrete way of talking about evolution would be to talk about the evolution of an organism environment field. And we can see when we pick out individual organisms, we can see ways that they're competitive, we can see ways that they're cooperative, but the background, I think, is this symbiogenetic process of unfolding whereby, yes, the organisms are having to adapt to an environment, which includes other organisms, but the environment is also adapting to the organisms, right? And most materialistic biology just looks at the way that organisms have to adapt to a fixed environment, but organisms make their own environments, right? And remake each other and enter into new relationships. So I think what's primary is relationship, right? Rather than competition or cooperation, it's just the relationship. And this goes for organisms and it goes for spirit and matter too. I'm not sure I know how to even begin imagining what spirit might be or what matter might be without the polarity between the two. So I just thought I'd offer that as another contextualizing factor to what we've been talking about. So, but thank you for your presentation. I loved it.
I want to offer just a quick comment. I always think about music, and it's interesting to note how music requires harmony and some degree of tension. The full journey of a musical piece starts usually in a place called home, musically, and then it moves into distance and tension. And that tension is somehow psychologically and spiritually really important for us to appreciate the return to the home at the end of the piece, but then feel somehow that we've been transformed along the way. The home is not quite the same that we started with, even if it is the same note that is being played. So I find perhaps it's a matter of perspective. And Weston, I love your movement of zooming out in order to see the possibility of a greater harmony. And living on the surface of planet Earth can feel quite competitive, I have to admit. Much of life around me, including myself and everything that's happening, I would definitely see competition as part of the nature of reality as it presents itself in this moment. But we are also so embedded within the competitive story that we can't even imagine life without it. So if I think of the divine spirit, I want to be able to move beyond my limitations and picture a harmony that rests in movement, still being creative without being in constant tension. And zooming away from the surface of the earth in my own inner mind, and I can see the whole blue planet. What appears like competition quickly resolves into a very beautiful blue glowing planet of harmony, and my participation in it, even if it feels tense in the moment, is part of this greater unfolding of life, quite an harmonious angle or perspective. So it's really about exercising different angles and perspectives, to be involved in the immediate, feel the tension, and then also be able to release oneself and zoom out, and ever so often remember the earth from space, what it looks like, and that we are a relational being, the way Matt speaks about it.
Well, with that very beautiful embryonic image, thank you, Richard. I want to thank Aya for your wonderful presentation and everyone for your comments and questions. Great way to start the day, guys.